Now, I think that's an important result. Of course, the challenge is to miss breakfast. If we miss breakfast, miss a meal, it could be breakfast, it could be lunch, but if we miss a meal, we miss out on the pleasure of eating, the reward of eating. So it's not easy to do. Of course, okay. I have to be very close to the microphone. Sorry. Okay, I'll keep close. So that's an advantage, potentially, that low-calorie sweeteners have. So I think the enjoyment of eating these, consuming these two drinks is almost identical. They're both sweet, they're both good tasting, but they differ in calories. So for a big difference in calories, there's virtually no difference in enjoyment of consumption. And indeed, we've done some studies to measure exactly that, how much someone enjoyed consuming these drinks. So we're not missing out on much pleasure if we consume Diet Coke instead of regular Coke, if any. So why do we get this result? Why is there no compensation or very little compensation for calories missed at breakfast time? Well, I think this is the reason. Because actually, we have stored in our bodies plenty of energy, plenty of nutrients to mobilize in order to maintain bodily function, even if we miss a meal, or even if we miss several meals. So this is a bit of an exaggeration, but breakfast is about 150th of the energy we have stored in our bodies, even if we're a lean person, that we could mobilize if we went out without that meal. So really, missing breakfast, missing another meal has very little impact on our overall energy balance. And we know that if we miss a meal, therefore, our blood glucose levels will be maintained well above the level that's needed to maintain normal physical and mental function. So we're not going to be compromised by that. And there's a good amount of research that shows, indeed, that's the effect of missing a meal. No effect, really, as long as we're a relatively healthy, well-nourished individual. Okay, so this is my interim conclusion. Perhaps I could stop here. It's almost too good to be true. By replacing some of the sugar or all of the sugar in a food or drink, low-calorie sweeteners reduce overall energy content and therefore should reduce total energy consumed in a day or a longer period of time. So that looks good. But this has been challenged. These ideas have been challenged. And there are two particular challenges that are resurrected, that are talked about a lot. One, we've heard both of these today already mentioned. So one idea is low-calorie sweeteners somehow confuse the mind, confuse our bodies. It breaks the relationship between sweet taste and calories, and thereby somehow messes up appetite control. And I'm going to look at that in quite detail, that idea in quite some detail. There's also another idea that by consuming sweet things, by consuming low-calorie sweetness, that increases our desire overall for sweetness, more sweetness, some of which might be sugar. And so I increase my energy intake if I consume low-calorie sweeteners, because I've become motivated to consume more and more sweetness. So I'm going to look at both of those ideas. So really, it was this sort of controversy, this, yes, low-calorie sweeteners, because they reduce the energy density of the diet, should help us control appetite, control weight. But there were challenges against them. So the question is, what is the evidence on this? What's the totality of the evidence? Let's not just pick studies that suit our particular viewpoint, but look at all the relevant evidence we can. So I sort of agree, I agreed to do that when it was suggested to me that this is what needed to be done. And I agreed because I got very interested in this subject many, many years ago when I was a postdoc. So this was like coming home again, and I wanted to know what the answer is. What do all these studies say? So here we looked at relevant animal studies. We looked at some observational studies, in particular prospective cohort studies, and I'll say a little bit about that. And we also looked at randomized controlled trials, which we split into shorter and longer term trials. So let's look at the animal data first, because actually some of the animal data are the origin of some of the controversy around this area. So I'm going to share with you some results on animal studies. Now, there's one group of animal studies which really contain two sorts of studies. Some of these were done, the main motivation was done to look at various toxicological effects of low-calorie sweeteners. So these were quite high doses of low-calorie sweeteners given to the rats. Either they were forced to consume them or they consumed large amounts voluntarily. And in these particular studies, body weight was one of the outcome measures. There were also other studies here which were about appetite effects of sugar, and low-calorie sweeteners were being used as control substances in those studies. And we identified 68 studies like this, overall relevant studies. And as you can see from these results, the effects on body weight, actually a majority of studies showed no effect. Some studies showed a decrease in weight, and a few studies showed an increase in weight. So clearly these studies overall showed really very little effect. If anything, a slight decrease or no effect on body weight of exposure to low-calorie sweeteners, as I say, often at quite high doses. There was another group of studies, though, that I'm going to describe to you in some detail now, because they are the source of quite a lot of discussion. So these are studies where what's been observed is an increase in body weight when low-calorie sweeteners are added to a supplement in the diet. And there were quite a few individual studies here, and as you can see, a majority of those, a large majority, showed an increase in body weight. And here is the background argument to those studies. These are studies by Terry Davison and Susan Swithers, and they're summarized nicely in this review paper. And this is the reasoning they take. So this is the hypothesis that low-calorie sweeteners potentially break the relationship between sweet taste and calories, and therefore disrupt appetite control. So that's the argument, and here are the studies. So I should describe exactly what these studies are about. So these are studies in rats, and these rats in the studies are divided into two groups. So one group, well actually both groups of rats get a dietary supplement, that's yogurt, for 3 days a week, and it's unsweetened. So it's non-sweet yogurt. Then one of those groups gets yogurt for the other 3 other days of the week. I think the researchers didn't come in on a Sunday, so that hence it's a 6-day-a-week study, but these are quite long-term studies. And in the saccharin group, the rats get sweetened yogurt with saccharin, and in the glucose group, they get sweetened yogurt with glucose, that's sweetened with glucose. And what the researchers argue is the saccharin group they call the non-predictive group. So in this case, the increase in sweetness compared with the unsweetened yogurt does not predict an increase in calories. Whereas the glucose group is a predictive group. Here, the addition of sugar, the addition of sweetness predicts an increase in calories. The findings that Swithers and colleagues report are shown in the graphs below. So the result is that the non-predictive group, the saccharin group, ends up eating more food overall. That includes, well, what I should say is the rats eat almost all of the yogurt, so they're given limited supplies of the yogurt, so they eat almost all of the yogurt. So this increase in intake, food intake, is due mainly to an increase in rat chow intake, so their staple food, which actually happens to be not very sweet, only slightly sweet. But that's another story, really. And so the non-predictive group gain more weight, primarily as a result of consuming more calories. And this is argued to be evidence in favor of this hypothesis that here sweetness is disrupting appetite control in these animals. Now, recently, an independent attempt at a replication of these results has been carried out by Bob Boakes, who's based in Australia. This is a very thorough study, makes good reading, I think. What I'm showing here is one of those situations where Boakes and colleagues get the opposite results to Swithers and colleagues. So actually, they find that the glucose, the rats getting the glucose yogurt gain more weight and get fatter. Now, I think there's various issues with these studies. What we're actually lacking is an unsweetened control group that just get unsweetened yogurt all the time. That would be good to have, but if nothing else, we've got these opposite results here. Now, why have we got these opposite results? Well, it's not clear. Boakes and colleagues suggest it might be to do with various technical aspects of the Swithers and colleagues' studies. They actually selected out rats that didn't consume much of the sweetened yogurts. Boakes et al. Argue that that may have actually selected for fast-growing rats, and that's why could be one of the reasons why there are different results here. Anyway, there are different results. I think the Boakes et al.'s results are more plausible because what the rats are getting there is an increase in energy density of their diet, which they're not fully compensating for. That's why they're over-consuming. That seems to be the result I would predict if someone described the study to me and hadn't told me what the results would be, then I would go along with the Boakes results. That's what I would have predicted. But I also want to look closely at the logic of this argument. So I've set out the argument here. The first part of it is that Swithers et al. Say, we reason that if sweet tastes are normally valid predictors of increased caloric outcomes, then these other things follow. Then exposing rats to a sweet taste that is not associated with these outcomes disrupts that predictive relationships, which in turn impairs energy intake and body weight regulation. But I would argue that this logic falls at the first hurdle, the first test here. It is simply not true that sweet tastes are normally valid predictors of increased caloric outcomes, and I'll show you that in a moment. What Susan Swithers says early on in this paper is that in nature and throughout most of our evolutionary history, sweetness has been a reliable predictor of the energy content of food. I just don't buy that argument, and I'll say why that is. So yes, these are modern diets. These are diets in Australia, the Netherlands, and the United States, looking at the relationship between sweet taste intensity of food, how sweet the food tastes, the relationship between that and the sugar content and the energy content of that food. What you can see here is, yes, there's a relationship between the sugar content of the food and sweetness, but not with energy content and sweetness. And this result is the same whether or not a few low-calorie sweetener products are included in this analysis. So it's not the case in modern diets that sweet taste predicts energy content. And I suggest even in what I would call perhaps natural or non-processed foods, minimally processed foods, that relationship doesn't hold up. We can just do really an armchair experiment here. What I've done is taken the energy content and the sugar content of fresh fruits, root vegetables such as potatoes, yams, turnips, and so on, and grains such as rice and maize and pasta. And as you can see, the energy content is, if anything, inversely related to the sugar content in those foods. And in turn, I would suggest the sweetness of those foods. So for me, the Swithers argument about a pre-existing relationship that sweetness predicts energy content is simply not true. And even if you look within individual foods, so look at the sweetness, the sugar content of strawberries, blueberries, and grapes. If anything, I would perceive strawberries as to be a sweeter food there, but it actually contains the least sugar and indeed the least calories overall. Okay, so I think I spent quite a lot of time on that argument. I don't see these animal studies really being supported either by logic or more recent results, and I suspect they're not relevant to humans anyway. Even if there was an effect like that, perhaps overall, the fact that low-calorie sweeteners dilute the energy content of our diet might outweigh that small effect, which I don't think exists, actually, as I've just said. Okay, let's look at some observational studies now. Well, these are prospective cohort studies. So these are studies that look at the relationship between change in low-calorie sweetener consumption over time and weight change over time. And what we find there, from our review, is actually really a null relationship overall. What I should say is the proponents of low-calorie sweeteners are harmful argument almost always cite the first study there by Fowler and colleagues, which does show, unlike all the other studies, shows an effect where low-calorie sweetener consumption is associated with increased weight. The problem with these studies, and Craig has already said this, the problem with these studies is even with prospective cohort studies, we can't separate out correlation from causation. So it's quite possible here that obesity causes or partly causes low-calorie sweetener consumption. And overall, the impact here is null. So there's no evidence here of a positive relationship overall. So this is the situation. We really can't separate out cause and effect. So what we need to do is clearly our randomized controlled trials, intervention studies, and we found plenty of those to look at. There were two types. We divided them into two types. What we call short-term intervention studies. So these are typically studies where participants are given a low-calorie sweetener drink or a sugar-containing drink, or potentially water. That's the majority of those studies. And then their energy intake at a subsequent meal is measured. And these are how those sorts of studies are done. So if I'm in this study, I get what we call a preload, which might be this blackcurrant drink here. It's a low-calorie drink, so it's got less than one calorie. And then after some interval, I have to drink the whole of that drink, and then at a variable interval, in most studies, that interval is about an hour. Overall, it was about 45 minutes across all the studies we reviewed. So let's say 45 minutes later, I'm offered a meal, and I've given more food than I can possibly eat, and I'm invited to eat until I feel comfortably full. And what the researchers are interested in is how much energy I eat in that meal. So in this case, I've had a low-calorie sweetener drink, and I've ended up eating 900 of the 1,500 calories I was served. Here's what happens on another occasion when I consume, on another day, consume a sugar-containing drink, 150 calories. The hypothetical results I've shown you, then say I've consumed 825 calories. So there's a very important result here. There's two important results here. The first result is that there's evidence here that sugar, liquid sugar, is suppressing appetite somewhat. So I've eaten less calories in this situation, 825 instead of 900, when I've had a sugar-containing drink. And actually, in these studies, I'm not told which one contains sugar and which one contains low-calorie sweetener. I don't know. The two drinks are as closely matched as possible. So this is presumably some sort of physiological effect of those sugar calories on appetite. However, you also notice that overall I've consumed 75 calories more if I add the drink, the sugar-containing drink, and the meal. So I've partially compensated for the calorie load in the sugar-containing drink, but not completely so. So I've actually eaten less in the low-calorie sweetened drink condition. So a key test is what happens when I consume water. Well, the results I've shown you here